Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brian Serra from the Minnesota ISSA. Thanks for joining today. So I wanted to introduce Kudelski and F5. They're going to be talking today on our webinar. And hopefully everyone has their ice cream and will enjoy this. So Shannon, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Well, hello everyone and happy Tuesday. Welcome and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend today's virtual ice cream social as we share with you about how to layer in application security protection. And to do some introductions for you, I am Shannon Garcia from Kudelski Security, and I lead our offensive security testing organization in addition to our application security integration consulting organization. I'll share a brief history about my background. I essentially started my career in the semiconductor industry as a quality engineer in a product engineering organization. I got my start into cybersecurity, learning how to perform security testing on web applications, and then quickly had to pivot into leading a delivery team. So I have experience building AppSec testing teams and also AppSec testing programs for large enterprise clients. In the last few years, I began expanding my focus with my clients from just app security testing to then really integrating security into their development processes. So with that, Nathan, if you wouldn't mind doing a quick intro for our audience and then share your background and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Nathan McKay, work for F5. I worked in IT for quite a long time, managing a bunch of like F5 gear and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So, you know, I was a security engineer at a Fortune 500 retailer. So I've dealt with a lot of the problems that you guys have and are dealing with out there in the real world. But these days I work with our F5, our marketing teams to talk about, you know, like how to best relate to the problems people are facing and how to, communicate our value proposition. And, you know, I do a lot of webinars just talking to people about security and about security issues in general. So it's kind of the quick take.
Awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. So the first thing I wanted to touch on is when we talk about application security, it really comes down to one thing, which is software and how an organization securely develops, manages, and maintains both new and legacy software in an environment. So things to keep in mind are that most development teams, or things that we keep in mind, are that most development teams don't necessarily build from ground zero. They typically pull from multiple sources, including vendor-controlled software, open source software, in conjunction with some form of custom software. We really see some combination of these across web applications. Goodness gracious, sorry, my screen is freaking out. How is that on y'all's side? Is it still showing or is it? Maybe it's just me.
Bobbing back and forth a bit.
Did y'all see it too? Okay. All right, that was kind of weird, but okay. Sorry about that. Also, I mentioned mobile applications, IoT devices, cloud infrastructures. As you guys know as well as we do, right, that the landscape truly is changing, and we are now beginning to see software-defined networks or infrastructure as code. And so regardless of the method in which it is done, and we know that there are multiple, we know and understand that ultimately software essentially goes through similar process steps. So meaning that the core elements or pieces of that process can be broken down into these, which is requirements, right? Design, develop, or your code build, testing, deploying, and then of course review. And with all of the both positive and negative learnings that are taken in and then sent back to the beginning, hopefully to improve from those lessons, and then that process really starts over. When I hear organizations talk about AppSec, sometimes they're only thinking of pen testing as an example, and even more common is just to point an automated tool at an application and spit out some list of vulnerabilities and potential vulnerabilities at that. but there are in fact opportunities at every phase of the development process in which security can be incorporated into that. This can include anything from threat modeling, the creation of detailed security requirements based off of very specific and targeted abuse case scenarios. There's SAS testing, manual code review, open source code analysis, DAS, there's hybrid testing, pen testing, as we mentioned. And of course, you want to add in your layers of protection to help defend against that broad spectrum of threat actors and threat agents once you actually deploy and go live. And for some, it really is the only measure that they have in place. Now, I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I have seen that's happening in the market, kind of based on my experience. It really is just kind of a rough picture, if you will, and it's honestly slowly shifting. It depends on what industry a client is in and what regulations and compliance mandates apply as it really pertains to security. So as you go from left to right, I have listed out some attributes. And again, this isn't like cookie cutter, it's just to kind of give a sense, right? But really it begins building, starting from essentially doing nothing to a little, which is, again, driven by a lot of those compliance and regulations needs. And then clients begin getting a little bit more rigor and building an AppSec testing program, which is usually where their security starts for applications. So network security testing was previously more common in what we saw in the testing space, and there was very little effort with application security testing on that side of the equation. So it may have been, some type of vulnerability scan, maybe there's some app assessments using some combination of scanning tools and manual testing. And then some may even start performing some level of, static analysis on their code. As organizations begin, an organization begins to move to the left or the shift left, which you may have heard, they're really beginning to have more of a robust testing program and perhaps performing some ad hoc security architecture reviews and threat modeling activities early on before they even begin developing code. As clients begin to move into that next state of maturity, we begin to see a more mature AppSec program where they are performing all of these security activities where there are some strengths in some of those areas and maybe a little less experience and less formality or process for some of the others, but regardless, they're still performing them to some level in some degree. And regardless of, where an organization is on this spectrum, right? Once an application is built, you need to make sure you're adequately protecting it and the data that interacts with it once it's deployed. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Nathan. And Nathan, I will drive slides for you. Just tell me when to advance. And he's going to share with you about some of the application security control points and what's actively being observed out in the wild today.
Sweet, thanks, Shannon. All right, so people obviously have to approach security from a couple different aspects. Out in the wild, we see people building controls at the network level. Obviously, you need to defend against things like DDoS and all that good stuff, and you have to be able to manage the identity of your clients and do things like modern authentication and authorization. But for this kind of the purpose of this presentation, we're talking about the application layer. Like, this is the code that runs your application, the actual pieces and components that you're using to build them, all of that good stuff. So we wanted to just make sure that we're talking about app layer security pretty specifically here. So next, please, Shannon. And when we talk about security at the app, I'm going to have you click next again because this is kind of a build. There's a few different things, right? There's different risk areas or different kind of threat actors or different classes of risks that people are dealing with out there in the wild. And because this is such a broad area, we've kind of broken it down into a few different categories. So one of those is, software vulnerabilities, common web exploits. These are problems that affect really any given application and all applications. And then there are like targeted attacks and advanced threat actors. Think APTs or people that are trying to break into sites specifically, different class of risk. On top of that, we've also got fraud, abuse, and business logic attacks. So these are things that aren't necessarily vulnerabilities in software or code. They are risks to the business and the way it operates online. So it's not getting hacked. It's, how to maintain your online presence and remain profitable and prevent, bad actors from causing bad experiences for your customers. And we're going to dive into all of these things a little bit further. Next, please. But before I do, I wanted to just do a little bit of level setting, and I'm going to have you hit next again so we can see the content. When we talk about like web applications, we're talking about a few different things. One of these is traditional web apps, the kind that we know and love, people sitting at browsers and, typing in information themselves, right? These are applications that are intended for consumption by human beings. They're typically browser-based. They're really well-known and well understood, and they're ubiquitous across customers and verticals. So everybody's dealing with these things. Next. And there are a bunch of challenges when we talk about defending against them. Because they are so broad and so diverse and use so many different frameworks, there is just this myriad of possible attack vectors. There's a myriad of possible inputs and accepted data formats. Because they're intended for human beings, they're often and very frequently targeted by bots posing as humans. So these are really, the kind of problems we have to deal with when trying to protect them, or considerations we have to take into account. Next. Then we've also got mobile applications. A lot of times these they're pretty basic. Some are really not very complex at all. They're typically, most are less complex than traditional web applications. They're just typically very simplified. Some of these mobile applications are nothing more than embedded browsers, and some of them use APIs exclusively. So there's no HTML, there's no CSS, there's no JavaScript, there's no opportunity to do JavaScript insertion, which is what a lot of WAFs do in order to do client-side integrity defense and things like that. So the way that we approach these applications is different than traditional web apps. Next. And of course, they come with their own challenges. As I mentioned, insertion of traditional security solutions, WAF. This is going to be a lot more difficult for many of these web applications, especially the ones that only use APIs, and it's also especially the ones that are nothing more than embedded browsers, because we don't necessarily have a means to cause the client to execute JavaScript. Some of the other challenges here are there are limited options for securing the client or validating the client-side apps. Sometimes you can rely on, like the app stores to make sure that customers are using the right versions of the applications. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you need to try to make sure that they are. And how you go about that, again, depends on the type of app and where it's running and all of that good stuff. So another big challenge here is that because they're intended for use by humans, again, they're frequently targeted by bots posing as humans. In fact, we've seen plenty of use cases out in the wild where bad actors have, basically rooms full of phones that are programmed with automation to pose as human beings using them, because it's easier than trying to like mock that up and use it, or use like headless browsers, for instance, to try to pose as humans. So again, a bunch of different characteristics or different challenges for mobile apps. Next, please. With APIs, again, it gets even more trickier. Because these are not typically intended for direct human interaction, the way we go about protecting them is different. They typically use common, well-known data exchange formats, think JSON, XML. So that's good in that we can have, like common set of controls across most of them, or we can do data formats, enforcement, things like that. But they're typically used by both web and mobile clients. So typically a lot of regular web applications are using APIs to fetch data and then display them and modify that data with JavaScript, etc. Next. But again, challenges here is because they're intended for use by bots and automation, both good and bad, we have a lot of problems. Authentication of legitimate clients is especially important, especially for APIs that are serving sensitive data. And because there's really no concept of session or workflow, we don't have a way of saying, okay, well, I know you were supposed to make this request and this request and this request first in order to delineate, a malicious bad actor from a traditional or a good or known one. So next, please. So let's talk a little bit more about these application layer threat classes. Software vulnerabilities, common web exploits. Again, think CVEs, the OAuth top 10, everything from cross-site request forgery to SQL injection, etc. Also think zero-day attacks, right? These are the risks that face any given application because every application is built on, existing code or existing components, and everyone has this problem. So we feel that every web application out there needs some level of protection, and we're here to kind of help you figure out what level that is. So from just the most basic blog out there, WordPress or what have you, to a multi-million-dollar gift card program application, they are all affected by this class of risk. It's just requisite, it's baseline across the board. Next, please. Beyond that, though, we've got a lot of customers or a lot of people out there are dealing with targeted attacks. If you're in a regulated industry or you have a lot of proprietary information, you can often be targeted by somebody looking to make ingress into your network to make off with that information. They aren't just doing like drive-by attacks, which is what you would often see with just software vulnerability exploitation, bots just trying to see what they can break into. This is the type of attacker that has made it their mission to break into your network, your application specifically. So these types of attackers are doing things like application reconnaissance and profiling. They're looking for site-specific vulnerabilities, and they are much more adept at bypassing security services because, again, we're not talking about just drive-by attacks. We're talking about somebody with time, energy, and intent in order to, affect you and your organization. So the class or level of control you may need to implement to deter this type of attacker is going to be different than just, what you would implement to protect a blog site, for instance. Next, please. On top of this, as we mentioned, fraud, abuse, business logic attacks. These are risks that affect people in ways that aren't just hacking, aren't just software exploitation. So think about things like denial of service or denial of inventory. If you are, say, an online e-tailer and you've been selling PlayStation 5s, you've probably been dealing with a bunch of bots and automation and malicious actors that are just trying to buy up all your inventory so they can resell it elsewhere, right? So that is going to cause a bad experience for your legitimate customers, the kind of people that you want to keep around. You want them to return over and over again to make more purchases in the future. If they're constantly being frustrated by the lack of inventory or poor customer experience because of that type of automation, you're going to have problems maintaining those relationships long term. So again, this isn't just hacking, it's the way that people use or abuse your service that can impact the long-term longevity and viability of your business. So next, please. So there's a lot that goes into, finding the right level of control. We can't say that, okay, basic signature WAF that defends against CVEs is good enough for all applications. It's not. Everybody needs that kind of protection, like we said. But you can't then go on to say that a managed fraud service is going to be requisite or needed for your blog site, right? You have to make a decision based on the amount of risk you're willing to accept, based on the types of risks your application is facing, based on the kind of industry you're in. And like that can be sometimes a complicated and frustrating process, but of course it's entirely necessary to maintain your operational viability and all that good stuff. So, you know, we're here to help you guys make that determination and help to find the right levels of controls. We know this can be kind of tricky, and it doesn't, it's not like just, you know, a decision that's made on an organizational basis. It kind of, in a lot of cases, needs to be made on an application by application basis, right? Like how you protect, you know, your mission critical applications is going to vary. It's going to be different than how you protect maybe some of your less critical applications. But that being said, we also know that there's been plenty of circumstances and times out there in the wild where the less critical apps are basically the support or utility, or sometimes called long-tailed applications, were the ingress points to some of the biggest hacks that we've heard about. You know, you probably remember the credit agency hack that happened a good few years ago. You know, they did all of their due diligence to protect the crown jewels and the main applications that were necessary for their own customers, but ultimately somebody found a way into their network through a, you know, low value, low criticality application, and then of course we had some huge problems from there. So it's not one size fits all. We know that you guys have to make a bunch of decisions in this respect. So next, please. So again, if we look at a risk prevalence by app criticality, and we're talking about software vulnerabilities, common attack vectors, CVEs, OAuth top 10, all that good stuff. Again, this is the type of risk that affects all applications. So from our perspective, again, every single app, everyone needs some level of control to defend against this. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Next, please. But, you know, these targeted attacks and advanced threat actors, this isn't a problem that everybody has. So not everybody is going to need, you know, more advanced controls or, you know, managed services or things like that to help defend against them. It's again, a calculation that you have to make. And again, it changes based on the types of applications that you have across your entire portfolio. Next, please. And what we found is that, you know, advanced fraud and highly specialized techniques, again, this is something that affects a much lower percentage of the market, but the risks and the costs and the impacts from this type of risk is much, much higher. You know, we're typically talking about like potential impacts in the millions of dollars, right? Where if somebody has successfully exploited or impacted let's say a Fortune 100 gift card program or application, they can do just tens of millions of dollars in damage annually. So they need to make a different type of decision and a different type of investment than, you know, a travel blog operator would. So again, it's knowing your risk area and finding the right areas to invest in. So next, please. So let's dig into this one a little bit more. Software vulnerabilities, common attack vectors. This is probably pretty tried and true, well-known information, but we wanted to just kind of cover it again. That, you know, these are things like vulns in software stacks that everybody is building on. And the reason everybody has this problem is because nobody is building their own operating systems or their own application servers or their own support libraries like OpenSSL, et cetera. They're leveraging off-the-shelf code and software components because it's what helps them get to market fastest with the least amount of investment, right? Everybody's trying to stay one step ahead, and this is the way that we do it. So everyone is building from, all of these different components, so everyone has this problem. Next, please. From there, like we talk about frequently occurring weaknesses in application code. So this is the code that you guys are building your own websites that are, run on top of, Apache or IIS or Nginx, and again, on top of like Windows, Linux, etc. But it's your own corporation's code that you've developed. And there's a lot of risks that come into play here. So things like cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, SQL injection, insecure deserialization if you're dealing with APIs. Again, this is different than just vulnerabilities in code. It is the vulnerabilities in the code that you've developed on top of the software stacks. So next. And then this is relevant to all but the most basic web applications, right? So when we talk about these vulnerabilities, right, the reason why this is such a huge problem for people is that new vulns are discovered in all manner of software all the time. So it's just impossible to ignore this. If you look at the graph on the right here, we don't have 2020 on there yet, but we're seeing, upwards of 15,000 new CVEs reported every single year. Not like 15,000 total, but every year. Who has time to deal with that? Nobody has time to deal with that. Nobody wants to. So people are looking for ways to protect their web applications with tools such as web application firewalls that can help deflect those attacks, give themselves breathing room, give themselves operational breathing room in order to, continue functioning while they're dealing with this and dealing with patch cycles and all of that good stuff. Because again, nobody wants to be tracking all of this. It's just a pain in the butt and it's too time consuming. Like, do you have the staff on hand with available cycles too? No, nobody does. So next. So some considerations here is that, again, looking at this another way, it's not just the number of vulnerabilities, but it's how frequently they're being released. We are seeing on average new high and critical CVEs released every 9 to 12 hours. So that's not to say that any given web application is going to be vulnerable to a new CVE that frequently, but that's how often a high and critical CVE is released. So your window and time of opportunity to address these risks is decreasing very rapidly because attackers are getting better and better at exploiting them faster. Next. And, as we can see here, based on F5's labs research data that we've seen out there in the wild, new exploits, actually like proof of concept code, toolkits, toolkit updates are being made very, very quickly. So we're often seeing proof of concept code published within 2 weeks of a CVE publication date. So that means that if you've got a new CVE, you don't necessarily have time to wait for a patch cycle before it's exploited out there in the wild. You just don't. You need something that can be updated on the fly, that can detect those attack signatures and block them. It's just too much of an arms race to attempt to deal with. Next. So this is kind of, Shannon, I'm going to have you just kind of click through this one, and I'm going to talk to it while it plays because it's kind of animated. But basically what we're seeing is that it's not even just that you need to defend against these things like right when they're released, but people are actually exploiting these vulnerabilities that were announced years ago, right? So in 2019, throughout the course of the year, we saw active attack campaigns that were targeting vulnerabilities that were first announced in 2018, 2017, as far back as 2014, 2013, etc. So it's really, really difficult for people to get, the takeaway again is it's really difficult for people to get coverage across all of their applications to get them updated, which is why we are still seeing people so successful at making ingress into people's networks based on old, very well-known vulnerabilities again, because this is a really hard problem to tackle. And again, that's where tools such as web application firewalls come into play, blocking those attacks on the fly so that you have coverage in case there was a miss in the patch cycle, etc. Because it happens. And oftentimes also that's a decision that your company has made sometimes, is to defer a patch because there's potentially like an issue with it, or it can't be tested fast enough, or you have a mission critical application that simply cannot be disrupted during a like a really busy buying season, or you think like Black Friday or the holiday seasons for a lot of online e-tailers. They simply cannot take their sites offline. They're absolutely critical to their operating margins for the year. So yeah, next please. So I wanted to just briefly kind of talk about these targeted attacks and some of the problems that people are dealing with. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but sites that can't be breached with automation and known techniques, they're going to be evaluated by human attackers for weakness. And people, human beings, hackers sitting at keyboards are really adept at this. Especially, we've got APT teams out there that are very well financed, that are basically run like companies because they more or less are. And when you're dealing with that type of attacker, again, it's not just a drive-by attack. It's not just somebody seeing if they can exploit a known CVE. It's them evaluating your site for weakness, and they behave differently, so the controls that you need are going to behave differently. Shannon, I'm just going to have you kind of click next a few times to get the bullets up here. But some problems that we deal with here is that human attackers can be very difficult to differentiate from customers, since so many of their attributes and patterns overlap. And this can be really, really tricky. So oftentimes we have to just kind of accept that people are casing our sites, and to try to use tooling to get a sense of who those people are and whether or not they're legitimate customers, right? These targeted attackers, the APTs, they're going to be much more adept at bypassing a lot of traditional controls, basic WAFs, especially. So you can't rely on one control, and you might need a layered approach. You might need a managed service. You might need SIM monitoring, etc. Like, there's a bunch of different things. And again, this goes back to doing that cost-benefit analysis, figuring out your risk appetite, and how much risk you're willing to accept, and how much you actually can spend to invest in protecting your digital properties. Because ultimately, the capabilities of some of these teams they're just going to outclass what you have on hand, in terms of the skills, capabilities, time of your SecOps and DevOps teams. They're just much more challenging to deflect. So again, you might need to invest more, maybe less, depends on the app. Next, please. So let's talk a little bit about fraud, bots, and abuse. We see this stat being bandied around all the time for a number of years now that, hey, half of the internet traffic is bots, right? You need bot solutions because of this. And what we found in the real world is that stat is more or less true, but it really doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell you how much of that bot traffic is legitimate automation. It doesn't tell you how much of it is business-to-business traffic. It doesn't tell you how much of that is, like basic bots versus advanced bots versus, like super obvious script kiddie type bots, right? So we know that there's this differentiation that has to be made, and I wanted to just kind of quickly touch base on that. So when you see that stat, just know it doesn't tell you the whole story. There's more to it, and it's not just a matter of saying, hey, bots are bad, they're going to do bad things. It's a matter of managing your relationship with that automation, because more and more people are relying on legitimate automation to do traditional functions that they used to do sitting down at their browser. More people want to ask their phone to make purchases for them or to do things that they would have traditionally sat down in front of a computer to do. So we need to make sure that we are facilitating those legitimate interactions, that we are able to recognize those clients and make sure that they're not impacting our business in negative ways. So next, please. But to that end, the risk posed by bots and automation is just as diverse as all of the attacks out there that you can imagine, right? People are leveraging automation to exacerbate all of these types of risks, and there's a bunch of different kinds of them, right? People are using bots in ways that are like able to scale attacks, and some of the results here is that this automation is polluting your data and your site metrics, right? Like if you're relying on your logs and your business intelligence to inform your business and to make decisions and to help tell your executive teams what to invest in and where you're having success in the market and where you're not, if you're unable to differentiate the automation from your legitimate clients, you may very well be making bad business decisions based on bad data. Because again, these bots are doing everything from polluting your site metrics. They're doing things like intellectual property theft, stealing your assets in order to clone your website for phishing attacks. They're doing web fraud, ad fraud. Like those are business risks. It's not just them hacking your sites. But of course, we've also got a lot of availability risks. So things like denial of service, infrastructure cost incursion, degradation of performance, denial of inventory. Again, these are problems where you might be incurring a lot of cost serving bots and automation that you don't want and have no use for. If half of your traffic is automated, or let's just say that a quarter of it is completely unnecessary, is malicious traffic, or it's just scanning, or it's just people poking around. If you're able to deflect that traffic because it's a cost sink, you can, in turn, make your security investments pay for themselves. You can demonstrate real ROI, especially if we're talking about applications deployed in the cloud, where you're paying for every CPU cycle, you're paying for every byte of traffic. It matters. It truly does. And it matters to the long-term viability of your business. Of course, we've already talked about the security risks presented by bots, footprinting, vulnerability scanning, vulnerability exploitation, credential stuffing, et cetera. We didn't really talk about that one, but next, please. But we've also found, this is kind of interesting, that there were some really interesting impacts over the course of 2020 based on the way that people were living and operating due to current events. Obviously, things like retail traffic was up 20%. We found that for some reason international money transfers were down quite a lot. But investment accounts are up 56%. Travel bookings, of course, down 75%. Grocery delivery up 400%. So the way that people are using applications is different these days, and having the right tools in place to give us visibility into these new buying patterns is more and more critical than ever as we find new areas of our business that we need to invest in to maintain competitive in the remain competitive in the market. So I'm going to have you click next, please. And we also just wanted to kind of give you a sense of some of the stuff we've seen out there, like a day in the life of a bot attack. We were dealing with a customer who was having problems with automation, just creating millions and millions of accounts in order to exploit a refer a friend loyalty program, right? There was some credits that they could get from these referral programs, and it was really hard for them to start, differentiate who was legitimate and who wasn't. Customers are, people are really, really afraid of false positives impacting their legitimate customers, and for good reason, right? It's customer trust is really hard to gain and really easy to lose. So being told, hey, we think you're a bot can deflect and, impact actual genuine purchases. And if that happens once, the customer may very likely not come back. So having tools in place that can recognize, legitimate consumers from automation, we feel is more critical than ever because so much of this automation is so easy to come by the attackers, right? There's millions of IoT devices that are being exploited all over the world. There's millions, tons and tons of unsecured cloud infrastructure that gets hacked all the time. And it's just a big problem. So having the tooling in place that can give you this visibility is more important, we've found, than really ever. So that's kind of one of the things we're seeing. Next, please.
All right, so to zoom things out a bit, this is a very detailed image with some various components, and we're not going to dive into all of it, but it really just showcases some of the security activities, right, through each phase and some of the types of associated tooling throughout that life cycle. And this really is to share with you those different types of activities that can be done, beginning with planning all the way through deployment. And again, going into the different tools that are needed from a protection standpoint that Nathan had just mentioned. And so again, through deployment, even though it's not shown, even from the point of end of lifing, just due to our minimal real estate here, but there are efforts that can be done. Moving on, that is really all we have. We do hope that there were some valuable insights shared with you today, and if anything, perhaps there are some things that you can take into consideration, or maybe some areas that can be improved from your lens of the world, as we are all constantly trying to move the needle and improve upon what we're doing today. So with that, I will open it up for questions if anybody has any.
It looks like we have a few questions via the chat. I don't know if you can see that.
Let me see.
Or via the questions panel.
Okay. Okay, I think the first one I see is, do you recommend implementing a policy and procedures to enforce the policy to ensure that the Secure SDLC is in place? There are some benefits to definitely doing that, and it gets a little bit tricky in terms of doing some of that from a manual perspective. There are ways that we are working with our clients to actually code some of these policy and procedure enforcements in as things become more automated, so that there's less of a manual need to do so. But yes, out of the gate, as you begin to include and implement some of these activities that perhaps you may not have been doing before, it's going to be a little bit of an adjustment to number one, put it online, and you don't want to, and we've seen this before, where clients will begin doing certain things, and if they're not performing certain activities, as an example, that now come online with, let's say, a number of vulnerabilities that come up, and let's say it's, they're now incorporating SAST into their development process with their developers. You don't want that to hold things up, because that just creates frustration for many. So it really is kind of working through those things and how those things get handled, what truly is real, and how do you, move forward with that process so that it's not, and again, we're trying to prevent security from being a blocker, and really enhancing, but as you continue over time, that hopefully continues to improve, and it becomes a lot more of a smoother process and really kind of built in, if you will. So hopefully that answers that question for you. And I don't know if are there any other ones that I'm missing?
It looks like they keep coming in. There's a few more.
Okay, let me see. And maybe I'm having issues because that's all I can see. Would you mind reading them off?
Not a problem. So what is an example bad bot of type advanced for user anomaly? So maybe that's more for Nathan's.
Yeah.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. What's an example bad bot of type advanced for user anomaly?
Okay, well, I guess I'm not quite getting what the question is asking, but there's, say for instance, like there's different classes of bots where, you know, people might just be able to use, say, like a curl or a bash script to make requests to an API. That's really like easy to differentiate. However, there on the other side of the spectrum, as we mentioned, there are people using actual farms of cell phones that have been programmed with automation that look like actual people sitting at and typing at telephones, right? So from the perspective of, you know, the site operator, one is very easy to differentiate and perhaps block, and the other is much more difficult. It looks like somebody browsing around your site, adding things to shopping carts, etc. So they can, you know, much more readily bypass a, say, like a bot mitigation strategy if they look like human beings, behave like human beings, and have all the characteristics of human beings. So a lot of, say, anti-bot solutions will try to take a bunch of characteristics into account, like you know, your screen widths of the client, whether or not it can execute JavaScript, how many plugins you have installed, what types of fonts, where that, what's the source address, like a million different characteristics to try to make a determination and basically give the bot like a risk score and try to detect whether or not there are anomalies in the way that that client looks. And that's going to be a really difficult process, right? Again, it takes a lot of, say, machine learning and a lot of intelligence to make some of those determinations. So we know that there are good tools that can help make those determinations because, again, it's a really tricky process. And again, depending on who you are, what industry you're in, and whether or not you have a lot of money behind your application, your likelihood or propensity to be dealing with that level of attacker is going to be different. And again, it just depends on who you are. But ultimately, visibility is the key to helping make these types of determinations.
Thanks, Nathan. Here's another one that might be able to play on the mobile devices that you mentioned. How are you understanding 5G devices now with that deployment advancing and accelerating that newest mobile environment and infrastructure?
Well, 5G makes it interesting because, you know, like it means that we have more and more connected devices than ever. And the problem, one of the problems with that is that, especially when we're talking about IoT, is that we're not investing in security for IoT devices, right? We're shipping millions, if not billions, of consumer-grade electronics that have minimal security controls in place, that, you know, are running old code, that are running outdated code, that never get updated, etc., which means that they are ripe for attack and the construction of massive, massive botnets. So some of the biggest DDoS attacks in history were conducted using, you know, exploited DVRs and fridges and, you know, Barbie cars and all of the million things that we're starting to put microprocessors into and connecting to the internet. And, you know, the reason why those things are so attractive, again, is because they're so easy to hack because they never get updated, old code, and it's really hard for a company that's manufacturing these things to invest in hardening them when the margins on building and shipping them are already so slow. So 5G, we think, is only going to exacerbate this problem. because it means that these devices not only are much, much more prevalent, but they also have a much higher amount of available bandwidth to be used for things like denial of service, et cetera. So it's a really interesting question, and it's going to pose some real challenges going forward, we think.
Thanks, Nathan. Let's see here. Can you provide some specific examples of solutions for mitigating known vendor open source software vulnerabilities before they could be patched? An example is given like a retailer during the holiday season where they might be in freeze. I think they're probably talking about some sort of compensating control or something to go and help them before patching.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So if you're talking about like a web-facing or a public-facing web application, or really almost any web application, a WAF or web application firewall is typically the tool that we would use for that. So say, for instance, at a previous company I worked at, a Fortune 500 retailer, we had an absolutely mission-critical web application that was, there were some vulnerabilities discovered in it in the course of an audit. And so the audit basically said, hey, you need to get these things patched immediately, or you need to shut down the web application, you need to shut down the application, or you need to compensate and control. So we looked at it, we canvassed the market, we found a good WAF solution that would work for us. We implemented it in front of that. It was able to block those vulnerabilities, and we were able to continue operating through our, through the cycle that it was going to take to meet those. Because when we went to the vendor and said, hey, we need to get this web application fixed ASAP now, they gave us a really super high price tag for doing it on that time frame. So it was actually cheaper to bring in WAF, to implement it, and to mitigate those vulnerabilities and continue operating.
Thanks. We have a couple questions around cyber resilience. One, have we heard about it? And two, if we have, what's the current state? And if we have any vendors that we've used or talk about.
So I guess I'm not particularly familiar with that. I mean, I guess I would just say, isn't that kind of like the idea that you are building and maintaining evolving controls to prevent, exploitation on an ongoing basis? That I guess I don't really have anything I can say specifically, especially in terms of vendors.
Okay.
So I'll have to research that one.
So we have another one around application security. How can application security programs maturity be measured?
That's actually really interesting, and maybe Shannon can take that one. I have a thought just.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we do get this question as far as cybersecurity programs and are specific to application. So there are a number of things that I've seen my clients from a measurement perspective as I've been working with them. Some of them come from the point of they were doing very little or as an example, they were only performing testing on PCI applications as an example, but yet they had hundreds of other applications that they were not fulfilling any type of security testing on, as an example, even outside of testing, right? There was no other security activities that were happening. So as they began to slowly integrate testing efforts for other applications, as an example, it began to then, bring on visibility and transparency to vulnerabilities that then existed for a lot of their application portfolio. And then, right, other metrics or things that can be measured as it pertains to that is, the time from the time you detect or identify a vulnerability, right? This really ties into your classification of your application and how that impacts things and the level of criticality to your business and the severity of that particular finding and what that may mean. But then you go into, how long is it taking my team to then mitigate that problem or put in some type of control or compensating control. Those types of things are things that we often see kind of over time. There can be vulnerabilities that still remain in the environment because maybe it's deemed to be a medium finding as an example, or even lower. So those will continue to persist, but there might be other things that continue to be added on. Obviously, things change. Development teams will add on, or product teams may add on new functionality to an existing application. So again, there's going to be some ebbs and flows, but those are going to be some of the common things that I have seen. And then, are we seeing trends with, findings, going down over time? Hopefully the answer is yes. There are other things that can be done in terms of the types of findings that are coming out, and we've tied it and associated it to specific development teams. So are we seeing systemic issues, as an example, for cross-site scripting or SQL injection or blind SQL injection or whatever the case is? Those are things that we can then take and then begin working with those teams to help educate so that we can change that behavior, and ultimately that's kind of the root cause that's there, so that we can improve those numbers over time. But those are some of the things that clients will look towards as far as metrics and measurement, as far as their AppSec program, and really kind of tying into the overall vulnerability management of what they're seeing, both from a network standpoint as well as application standpoint.
How about those that are using an agile development pipeline? Does that change anything?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for our clients that are using Agile, the same things ultimately apply, right? And again, the big ones for our clients are going to be time to fix. Or time to remediate or amend. So again, there's going to be some nuances with respect to that, but many of them still remain the same and how it's going to impact their business.
Great. There's a very specific question about Jenkins. If we are familiar with that, I know we have that in our environment. But I think it's pretty prevalent. What do you folks think?
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of companies are using it to do, CI/CD testing and deployments and all of that good stuff. One of the things that we've talked about and are trying to promote more and more often is that, this idea of, we say shifting left, but basically bringing the security controls into that pipeline sooner and rather than later, so that the like WAF policies and the security policies can follow the application through the life cycle, can be run through all of the testing use cases and things that people use tools like Jenkins for, so that those potential issues with the policy and policy deviations and the changes that need to be made to it, evolve with the application as it progresses into production. So we certainly have done a lot to make, in terms of F5, our tooling accessible and available in that regard and integral into those processes.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it there. Any closing thoughts?
Just thanks for the excellent questions. It's good to see some engagement from people. So thank you.
Agree. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Have a good day.